Good evening, everybody. If I could ask you all to come on down and fill in some chairs. We've got chairs up here for one and all. And I'm here very briefly to introduce our guest and speaker for the evening event. My name is Craig Gill, and I'm the editor-in-chief at the University Press of Mississippi. And I am delighted to be here today to welcome Devery Anderson. Let me first get out a few thank yous. Thanks as always to Lemuria for this wonderful space, which we have made good use of over the years and will make good use of for many years to come. Thanks also to Book Friends, the organization Book Friends, which I hope you all belong to, and if you don't, I encourage you to pick up one of these pamphlets right at the back there. They support the University Press of Mississippi, they support our work, and they bring all this wonderful food out here for us to enjoy. So, thank you to Book Friends. And now let's get on to the reason why y'all are here, which is to hear a few words from Devery Anderson. This is the book, which I hope you all have a copy of, and Devery has been signing copies, and he'll be available after he speaks if you haven't gotten your copy signed yet to get it signed afterwards. And this is, well, I say this is the book on Emmett Till. We're very, very proud to have published this book. Devery is a resident of Salt Lake City, Utah, but he's spent the last 20 years, I would say, working on the Emmett Till case. And when I say working on it, I mean being in Mississippi, being in the Delta, talking to people, interviewing people, going to the FBI files, doing everything imaginable to recreate and to tell us the story as it happened as best as we can know, but also to tell us what happened after and what has happened since. And that's what this book is. This is the single most complete account of probably, if not the most pivotal, one of the most pivotal events in the history of the civil rights movement. So this is a good book. We're delighted to be publishing it. We're delighted to have Devery here today. And I want to invite him to come up here. I'll get out of everybody's way. Devery, please come on up and tell us a little bit about your work.
All right. Thank you, Craig, for that. I appreciate it. And yes, my name is Devery Anderson, and I'm from Salt Lake City, Utah. Born and raised in Longview, Washington, but spent the last 20 years in Utah. I moved there to go to school my sophomore year at the University of Utah. And it was when I first moved there that I was at the city library one day and just decided to, because we just moved there, I just got my library card like that day, decided to look over the film section, and I saw this video series called Eyes on the Prize, which was a PBS documentary series about the history of the civil rights movement. And I thought, well, I just learned some about black history this previous year at the college I was at, the community college, so I checked that out of the library and sat down and watched the first episode. The first segment of the first episode contains 15 minutes about Emmett Till, and so it was in September of 1994 that I got my introduction to Emmett Till. And when I saw what had happened, and I'm sure it's probably a dumb question, but is everybody familiar with the Till case? Do you know basically what happened? 14-year-old young man from Chicago comes to Money, Mississippi, and this is what I learned in this segment, of course, and naive as to the ways of the South at the time, being raised in Chicago, and he goes in this little country store in Money and whistles at Carolyn Bryant, 21 years old, working behind the counter, and that little innocent flirtation cost him his life. 3 days later, in the middle of the night, he was kidnapped and then murdered, and his body discovered 3 days after that in the Tallahatchie River. And when I saw this, I was so shocked that this could happen. And when I saw the photo of him that was taken and published in Jet magazine, I saw this combination of the beating and being in the river 3 days and the decomposition and the swelling. All of that was published in this magazine, and his mother insisted on this open casket funeral. And when I saw that image of him come on the screen, it was in that moment I remember I felt like my heart broke and felt this just sadness and depression come over me that I couldn't shake. As soon as that segment was over, I went and started looking up to learn more about this case, and I was shocked at the time that there wasn't much out there. And then I would look in indexes. Any book I found on the civil rights history, whether it was on the civil rights movement or specific episodes of the civil rights movement, I would always go to the index, and first thing I would look for was Emmett Till. Sometimes I would see something, sometimes I wouldn't, and sometimes what was there was just mentioned in passing, and I thought, you know, I know this case played a bigger role than it's getting credit for, because what had been published, there was a book by Stephen Whitfield called Death in the Delta that talked about the impact, but it was written in 1988. It was getting kind of old, and there wasn't a lot of original research. It seemed like he was taking a lot of his information from Eyes on the Prize and that, and I was wanting something that really got into every aspect of the case, because there were so many details that were so important that needed to be told. And after thinking about it for about 10 years, from like 1994 to 2004, and in that time I had come to know Emmett Till's mother. She died in 2003, so between 1996, about 2 years after I first learned of the case, I got the courage to write her and to see if I could interview her for a class project. And she didn't respond to that letter. She was busy. And so the day the class was, or as my project was coming due, I thought, well, I better call her and see if I can get an interview. And I was scared to death to call her, because I didn't know what her reaction really would be. I didn't know if she kind of wanted to forget about all this, or if people bugged her enough and she would just see me as just someone else bothering her. But when I called and we talked, she put me at ease immediately. And we became friends over that next 6 years until she died. And so in my mind, I had all these ideas going. I was so passionate about the case. Then when the FBI opened the case in 2004, as a result of new information that had come to light that they felt was persuasive enough that it was worth the time and money to investigate to see if there were others involved that might still be living. At that point, that was in May of 2004. A few months later, I decided that I was going to write a book. So in the fall of 2004, I started doing research. That's when I started coming to Mississippi a few times a year, interviewed people over the years, and then turned in the manuscript in fall or early winter of 2014. So it was about 10 years of active researching and writing, 10 years prior to that thinking about it and letting things gel and trying to figure out what my role was going to be in this. And of course, during that time, I knew there was going to be this end to the FBI investigation. So as I was working on my book, I knew the final chapters. I didn't even know what the outcome was going to be yet, but I knew that I wanted to include this in the book. And so the book includes the case as it unfolded in 1955 to 56, and then when it reemerged in 2004 to 2008, basically, when I consider that the end of the Till case in this generation as far as what was being done about it, because in the fall of 2008, right before he left office, President George W. Bush signed into law the Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Act, which had been pushed through Congress and was passed 422 to 2 in the House, and after a brief block by Senator Tom Colburn, he removed his opposition and it passed with unanimous consent in the Senate as well. And this allows up to $13.5 million a year to investigate cold civil rights cases. So when you think of Emmett Till and the question, did he die in vain? There's this answer that I can say, definitely not. He did not die in vain. The effects of his death there was never justice in his case, but because of that case, other cases have been investigated, other people have been brought to justice over the years. And so that's one reason the case seems so relevant still. A lot of reasons it is. Its role in the civil rights movement, but its role today in what it's done. And so that's the background as far as why I got so passionate about this and why I decided to write this book. There's so much to say about the experience in writing it and what I learned for myself. As Craig mentioned, and not to brag too much, but there's been stuff that's been done on the case, but nobody has ever tried to just sit down and write a full account from beginning to end. All the details in that. And one of the hardest things that I found myself doing, and or trying to do, was to talk to people. I wanted to get people on both sides of this. Both sides of the case. People who were from Emmett Till's family. I wanted to learn more about the men who were tried for murder, J.W. Milam and Roy Bryant. Previous books about them, there wasn't much that was known. It was interesting that both of these men were able to die in obscurity pretty much. When J.W. Milam died in 1980, the only mention of his death was a brief obituary in the Delta Democrat-Times. Just a standard obituary like you see for anybody. Nothing was said about him, no articles that were published that I could find separately talked about his role in the case, none of that. Same thing almost happened with Roy Bryant, but Bill Miner, who had covered the case for the New Orleans Times-Picayune back in '55, he caught the fact that he had died, and he wrote something in one of the syndicated columns that talked about Roy Bryant. But that was the only time really either one of those two were mentioned. And so the people of this case were able to pretty much die in obscurity and were kind of forgotten about. And the same thing almost happened really with the Till family members as well. For 30 years after the case, after Emmett Till's murder, Emmett Till's mother, she would speak occasionally, locally, but not nationally at all. But for some reason, with the 30th anniversary of the murder in 1985, this interest began to reemerge. That's when Eyes on the Prize came out. That's when the Clarion Ledger did a 30th anniversary series of articles back in 1985. Even interviewed Roy Bryant at the time. He didn't say much, didn't really want to talk to anybody, but he was interviewed. And I think the Today Show had something about it. And then it was a few years after that, what books were out at the time, when I started doing my research, had come out. There were 2 books. And so but they weren't telling the story the way I thought it should be told, and there was so much to learn. There was so much to learn about the people involved and how this case impacted them. And that's what I feel I've been able to do as a result of this. I did talk to people who are close to the men who were tried for the murder. None of them would talk to me and allow me to use their names. They allowed me to paraphrase what they told me, but I couldn't quote them directly. And I had to list them as confidential source A and confidential source B. And there were others who just didn't want their name in the book for fear that others might be upset with them or seek revenge. And so I think there were 4 or 5 sources that let me interview them. I had to persuade one for a few years, and they finally did. Another one that I thought would not was pretty willing. This person hadn't really been asked about this before. And so that person allowed me to interview them. And so I was able to find out how this case impacted people like that. And in all cases, it was quite tragic. Chapter 10 of my book talks about what happened to all the people, at least the principals in this case, after the trial and after the case fell from the news. And I was taking a chance writing this chapter because I didn't know if people would really care in a lot of these cases what happened to these people. But I thought, well, if you have endured the first 9 chapters and lived through that trial, lived through the acquittal, felt that anger, saw these men get away with murder, that you might wonder, well, what happened to them then? And one of the reasons I did that too is because over the years I run a website called EmmettTillMurder.com. And I have information about people and some articles I reprint and other stuff like that. It's always I'm always updating it. But over the years, I've received lots of emails from people from all over the world, really, and they ask, what happened to Emmett Till's mother after his death? What happened to his uncle Moses Wright? What happened to Carolyn Bryant and Roy and Bryant and J.W. Milam? People kind of want to know, so I spent a lot of time researching that because nobody had really talked much about these people. And I wanted to find out what happened. So I spent a lot of time doing that, and I hope that chapter, I've gotten positive feedback about it. I was nervous about it at first because I thought maybe no one really cares about them and what happened, but I think maybe you will, and I think you might find that chapter quite interesting. Writing the book too, I felt like I had to relive a tragedy, even though it was 50 years old at the time. It is now 60 years old. I've discovered that the Till case, unlike a lot of other tragedies, it stays with us in a way that it doesn't become part of the past. And I've learned this from people too over the years, that we probably all, and I did interview somebody who actually walked by Emmett Till's casket back in 1955 during the funeral. And I interviewed her, and to her it was as vivid today as it was then. She said she had nightmares as she walked by that open casket that she wasn't expecting to have, but when she saw him, she said, "I had nightmares for weeks, and after that a lot of us would not allow our young children to go to the South in the summers to visit their relatives anymore," which was common to do because so many people moved to Chicago during the Great Migration. They still had relatives in the South, and they would travel back and forth. And it wasn't anything for someone to send their teenage child to the South for the summer. A lot of people, after the Till murder happened, stopped doing that. And she remembered vividly how that was. But I've discovered it's not just those who walked by the casket or saw this unfold at the time. People today who learn about the Till case for the first time, when they see that picture that was originally published in Jet magazine, they experience that same shock, horror, and grief that people did then. And I get emails from people who sometimes will go on forever and ever in their email, just pouring out their heart on how this made them feel. They've been wanting to talk to somebody about it since they discovered it. It's not uncommon to say, "I'd never heard of this case, I just learned about it, I saw that photo, and I'm in shock." I get that all the time, and that's how I was as well. And by the time I started writing my book, I felt like, I've known about this case now for 10 years, I've researched so much of it, I know the story. But when I got in there and kind of began again and talking fresh to people who experienced it, that heartbreak I felt in 1994 just started all over again. And over the years, Emmett Till's mother talked in documentaries and and in her own book about what it was like to learn of her son's death and to go to the funeral home and examine his body. And I went to the earliest sources I could find about this when it was fresh on her mind and she was still mourning his death. I thought I'd read a little bit from the chapter 3 in my book when they discovered his body, and read a little bit about what it was like for her over that next few days as she discovered that. So for a little bit of background, he was killed on Saturday or Sunday morning, August 28th, 1955. His body was discovered 3 days later on August 31st. Now, as she spent a few days searching, or he had been missing for 3 days, she was in Chicago still, but she was in contact with family in Mississippi, with the police. Back and forth was going on. And for 3 days, she said, we stood there, we sat there, we waited for 3 days trying to find out what happened to Emmett. And this took its toll on Mamie, who was Emmett's mother. Mamie Bradley was her name. Her mother, Alma, took its toll on her as well, and she finally collapsed in an emotional climax to the 3-day ordeal. It was at this moment, Mamie recalled, when I realized for the first time in my life I was going to have to stand up on my feet and be a woman, a real one. Up until this point, she had really relied on her mother to solve all of her problems. She talks about this a lot. Her mother was very strict, and she relied on her for so much, but now she was having to endure something on her own that her mother couldn't even endure in the same way that Mamie did. And beginning Wednesday, August 31st, she would need all the strength she could muster. That morning, between 6:30 and 7, near the town of Phillip in Tallahatchie County, 17-year-old Robert Hodges was fishing in the Tallahatchie River near a spot called Pecan Point. While inspecting his trot line, he noticed something in the distance. It was a pair of human legs protruding up above the surface of the water. Hodges checked on his lines, went home, and told his father of his awful discovery. The senior Hodges got word to his landlord, B.L. Mims. Someone else then notified County Sheriff H.C. Strider. And then I'll skip a little bit here because then everything unfolds in Mississippi. Emmett's uncle Moses Wright comes to the river and identifies him. And then it was later that morning that the Chicago Tribune called Mamie Bradley's home, knowing that her son, they had learned on his wire services that Emmett had been found, but they didn't want to break it to her over the phone. So they called her and asked if she'd heard any more news. She said, no, I haven't heard anything. So at that point, they knew she hadn't been told yet. So they called a friend of hers to break the news for them. And she said, when her friend Ollie called, Ollie Williams, she was nervous and hesitated, which alerted Mamie that something was wrong. For God's sake, whatever it is, let me have it, because I can probably take it better than anybody around here anyway, she demanded. Williams then carefully and sensitively told Mamie what she had just learned. Emmett had been found dead in the Tallahatchie River. He had been beaten and weighed down with a cotton gin fan tied around his neck. Calmly, Mamie wrote down all these details and then read them to her mother and her aunt, Marie Carthen, who was waiting nearby. Carthen immediately became hysterical. Take her out of here, yelled Mamie. Don't let her start. Indeed, a mother's worst nightmare had begun. And quoting her, as I sat there, I suddenly divided into two different people. And this is what she told this in a speech a couple months later, so this isn't in her book, worded like this. I divided into two different people. One was handling the telephone, the other was standing off telling the other what to do, or helping me keep myself under control. And the second person told me, you don't have time to cry now. You might not have time to cry tomorrow. And her tears and mourning had to wait because the trial began just 3 weeks later. That seems unheard of today, that somebody could be arrested for murder and 3 weeks later you're on trial. And within 4 weeks the whole thing was over. The men were acquitted and that. But Mamie Bradley had this task of going to the funeral home to identify her son. His body arrived in Chicago on Friday morning, September 2nd. And when she went to the funeral home, two men from Jet magazine were there waiting. They'd been waiting from midnight the night before to witness this. And when she went into the funeral home, this was Simeon Booker, who worked for Jet magazine up until just a few years ago when he retired, and I think he's still alive in his 90s. Just wrote a book himself a couple of years ago about his years as a journalist. And also David Jackson, who was a photographer for Jet magazine. They went in right behind Mamie. She stayed there, identified her son, and then went home to bring some clothes back. And when Mamie left, Booker and Jackson stayed behind and watched as attendants lifted the body from the casket and placed it onto a slab. In that instant, they were horrified to see a piece of Till's skull fall and bits of his brains come out. Calmly, Simeon Booker said, Dave replaced the skull, just like putting on a hat. And when I read that for the first time from Simeon Booker, and how he was able to state that so matter-of-factly, partly because time had gone by then, but it wasn't an uncommon thing to have to witness at the time. Jet magazine covered stories like this, and the Till case was another one of those, but yet it had such significance that when she decided to have this open casket funeral, it alerted the press from everywhere, and it became an international story. So much of this stuff had been confined to the news of the South when it made the news. There's a book, 100 Years of Lynching, where you see these headlines for these lynchings where it would be advertised just like you're advertising a garage sale almost. Lynching next Saturday night. And that wasn't that type of coverage wasn't still happening by 1955. Lynchings had subsided and had disappeared, at least for a while. For 3 years there wasn't at least a recorded lynching. But after the Brown decision, there was this immediate backlash. Because the Brown decision, people saw a slippery slope that if we do away with segregation in schools, then there'll be race mixing, and there'll be all this stuff. And that was their biggest fear. That's why there was segregation in the first place. When you think of having to segregate even drinking fountains, there was this fear, this intense fear of mixing the races, or that the races could possibly be in a situation where they would mix and ever be intimate. And so, and with the Brown decision, people saw that, you know, with voting rights, there's slippery slopes that people feared so much. If black citizens get the right to vote, then they'll take over, then there'll be no more segregation. And so the people running for governor that year tried to outdo themselves in 1955 as to who was the biggest segregationist, and they knew that had to be their platform. And Emmett Till comes to the South right as this was going on. In fact, the very day that he whistled at Carolyn Bryant in the store was when the governorship was won by J.P. Coleman, or at least announced in the papers. He won the day before, but it was headline news that day. And then that night was when Emmett Till had his experience with Carolyn Bryant. So we see what the setting was like at the time, and how courageous it was for Emmett Till's mother to allow, for the first time really, a case like this to go out and become international news. And what it did, even though Emmett Till's killers were never brought to justice, and even though others who were involved were never brought to justice, that his mother's biggest, dream, since justice couldn't happen, is that he wouldn't die in vain. And that's exactly what happened. His death woke up the world in ways that lynchings prior to his never had the power to do. And it was partly because of his mother's insistence on an open casket funeral, partly because he was a child, partly because he was from the North. That combination allowed the press to get involved, and the press, told the world, and the world woke up in ways it never had before. And one of the things I can tell you, having researched the lives of Emmett's mother and the men who were involved in his death, she told me once in my first interview with her, I asked her, have you ever heard from these men or their relatives? She said, I've had no contact whatsoever from any of them. I thought maybe somebody at some point would come forward and apologize on their father's behalf, or grandfather, or whatever. Nobody ever did. But she said, mercifully, and these are her words, the Lord just took them out of my mind and out of my heart. I don't feel hate, I don't feel love, I don't feel anything. She goes, but one thing I do know is that I went on and became a benefactor to society. They went on and became scourges to society. And what she meant by that, neither one of them, they of course were married, they had children and that, but they both struggled a lot with jobs, with J.W. Milan especially couldn't hold a job. His wife ended up working for years and years at a beauty salon in Greenville, and worked there until the 80s when she retired. Roy Bryant went on to become a welder, was actually convicted for food stamp fraud in the 80s by taking food stamps and selling them back to the government, and taking them for half their value and selling them at full value to the government. And he got convicted twice for that in the 80s, served some time in federal prison, but eventually they both died of cancer. And so their lives were not happy ones, from what I could find. Mamie Bradley's was. She lost her only child, but she went on and helped hundreds and hundreds over the years with the Emmett Till Foundation that she started, and the Emmett Till Players. So you really see these lives go in different directions. So you can be in a prison without walls that you kind of create for yourself. And so even though people can often get away with stuff, they don't really in the long run, I don't think. And so I tried to document a lot of this because I wanted to, all as much as I could. And it was important for me too to do that, because this is the type of thing where the more you read, the more questions you have, the more satisfaction you need to try to find out all you can. And my goal was to have a book that in one source people could learn all they wanted as they read. If they had more questions, those questions I think get answered later in the book. A lot of them are answered in the footnotes, and I spent a lot of time talking about contradictions in the story. People who were at the store with Emmett Till heard their memories today. If you talk to any of them, none of them agree exactly with what happened. So I had to go back to the earliest sources when it was brand new and see what they said at the time. And I work all this out in the text when possible. If not, it's in the footnotes. But I tried to write a book that everybody's questions would be answered, so you can come away saying that I know about this tragedy now. I know fully. And the questions that I've had for years, and which will be the case of some people, that I think that they've been answered. And if not, I want to know what questions you still have in case we do a second edition down the road. Thank you. Do we have some time for questions? I don't know what time we have to go, but yes.
Were you able to talk to the jurors who sat on the trial?
They were all dead by then. The closest I got, and if you didn't hear the question, it was if I was able to talk to jurors, and I was not. The last one died before I started my research, but it was interesting. I talked to family members of the grand jury who met in November 1955 to see if there was evidence or to indict the men on the kidnapping, and that was the one that. Their men were indicted on murder, but during the trial, the defense attorneys argued that the evidence was too circumstantial. They said, we don't even know if the body was Emmett Till. And so that was the excuse the jury used to acquit the men, is that they couldn't prove the body was Emmett Till. Well, for the kidnapping phase of this, which happened in November, Milam and Bryant had confessed to the deputy of Leflore County, George Smith, and his deputy, John Cothran, that these men that these men kidnapped him. They told him that they did, and they told him before the body was found. They said, yeah, we kidnapped him, but we let him go once we found out he wasn't the right boy. Well, then when his body surfaced 3 days later, they weren't expecting that, because they tied his body to a cotton gin fan and expected it to just stay underwater. And so they could say, yeah, we let him go, and I don't know, I guess he didn't find his way back home. Well, they had confessions for kidnapping, but the grand jury refused to indict them on kidnapping. Well, with a grand jury, you don't have to have the unanimous vote. And somebody from a granddaughter of one of the jury members from the grand jury wrote me and said that her grandfather was one of the ones who wanted to indict, but there wasn't. But there was like the majority voted to return a no true bill, and so they weren't indicted. So that's the closest I've been able to learn anything about the jury, other than what others who have researched in the past. Steve Whitaker, who did his master's thesis in 1963, did interview all the jurors, and they all told him pretty much that none of us, I guess one person of the 12 doubted that the body was Emmett Till, but everybody else were sure it was. They were able to tell him this 8 years later, but during the trial, when interviewed after the acquittal, they said, well, they couldn't prove it was Emmett Till. None of them, except that one, had any doubt. They knew it was Emmett Till. So it sounds like they were just looking for a reason to acquit. The evidence was there. It was circumstantial, but you have a kidnapping confession that the deputy and sheriff said in court. They testified to that. You have Emmett Till's mother positively identifying him, and the ring that was found on his finger was a ring that had belonged to his father. And you put it all together, and there was no question. And then, of course, the men confessed in Look magazine after the trial, when they were safe from further prosecution. They confessed for $3,150 that they did, in fact, murder Emmett Till. And at that point, they couldn't be retried. So, but yeah, that's all I know from the jury, is what others who were able to interview them directly. And so I was able to benefit from Steve Whitaker's research on that.
What did you just say, that you received $3,000?
Yes, in October of '55, a reporter named William Bradford Huey decided, and he was one of these checkbook journalists who thought, if I offer them enough money, they were going to tell me what happened. He didn't have any doubt. He knew they needed money probably. They were going to struggle financially, that no one was going to come to Roy Bryant's store anymore, and he was right. The store closed down about 3 weeks after the trial because people boycotted it. So he knew that they were going to be in a position to need money, and so he went to their attorneys and said, you know, I pretty much know your clients were guilty, and here's what I think they did, and do you think you can get them to talk? And John Whitten said, you know, I never asked if they were guilty, but my guess is that you're right. I'll talk to them and see if they'll talk. And there was some hesitancy. One of them was willing, the other wasn't, then the other one was, and the other wasn't. But I know for a fact that, because I have the release forms that J.W. Milam and Carolyn Bryant signed, they both signed releases to William Bradford Huey that for $3,150 would be what they would pay them to tell
Each or
total. They had to split it. And there's some question if J.W. Milam even gave any to Roy Bryant. He was saying years later he didn't see any of it, so I don't know what they did with it. But they did get that amount. And there was a signing ceremony at the Sumner Attorney's Office in October, like 22nd or 28th of 55, and the article appeared in January, the January 24th issue of Look magazine. It's called Story of Approved Murder in Mississippi. And after that, the supporters of Milam and Bryant stopped supporting them. They knew they were guilty, but they didn't want to hear about it. Once they had to hear about it, and once it was in print, there was this embarrassment, I think, that they felt, and they didn't want them in their communities. They both eventually left Mississippi for a while. They moved back, but after everything had settled down. It took about 15 years for Roy Bryant and Carolyn Bryant to move back. They stayed in Vinton, Louisiana for a long time. Yes?
They have renovated and historically brought the courtroom back.
Yes.
Have you seen that?
Yeah, I was there. I've been there a few times. I was in March when they had Dorothy Moore come and sing, and Senator Cochran was here. I was here for that in March. And so, yeah, it does look like it did pretty much in 55, except for what modern things they couldn't avoid doing. But it is, you go in there and you really get a sense now. It feels a lot smaller than you'd ever imagine it would look. When the papers talked about how there were 500 people crowded in there during those first few days of the trial, till the judge said no more standing in the aisles, it's a fire hazard, and no air conditioning, and how they allowed smoking in there. Wow, when I was at the book fair the other day and I was dying in the heat, I thought, how did anybody sit through this trial in those conditions? I couldn't even imagine it. But so when you're in there now, you get a sense that it's not very big, and that must have been a nightmare being in there. But I'm glad they put the money into it and preserve that. It's part of our history, and it's going to help the county. Yes.
Aside from Emmett Till's mother, did any heroes emerge during your research?
Well, one was one of the witnesses, Willie Reed, who was an 18-year-old sharecropper in Drew. He was walking to the store the morning of the murder and saw a pickup truck pass, and he noticed a few men in the front of the truck, and he said he noticed 3 or 4 black men in the back. Didn't think much of it. The truck passed him. He kept walking. This is about 6:30 in the morning. He was on his way to the store. And a little bit later, he passed a shed, and he saw that pickup truck parked there. And when he passed the shed, when he was walking, he heard somebody being beaten inside the shed, like being pistol whipped. And he heard someone crying and this beating sound. And so then he went into the home there on the plantation of one of his friends, Mandy Bradley, and said, I think Mr. Milam is beating somebody out in that shed. And so she told him to go back out and kind of get some water from the well so he could hear what was going on. And he did that, and then he kept walking, and then after he went on to the store from there, and a few minutes later he turned around and saw J.W. Milam leave the shed, get a drink of water, and go back in the shed. And so soon the prosecution, through the black press, got wind that there were some witnesses on this plantation that could place Emmett Till with the killers. And so Willie Reed was just 18 years old. He was scared to death, and he spoke barely above a whisper in his during the trial. He was that scared, but he did point out J.W. Milam in court and told what he saw that day. So he was a hero because, he was totally out of his element. And after that, he had to flee to Chicago and move there and moved in with his mother. He'd been living with his grandparents in Drew. So he left Mississippi for the first time the day the trial ended. That night, he flew to Chicago with Representative Charles Diggs and Dr. T.R.M. Howard, and they arranged for him to move to get a job in the North. So his life completely changed as a result of this, and he was scared, and he felt he had been threatened and that, so he left Mississippi immediately. So his life was altered, but he was brave enough. He could have just said, no, I didn't see anything, and just gone on with his life, but he testified in court. And everybody who remembers hearing him, and I've talked to people who were there, said he was just shaking like a leaf and wouldn't speak above a whisper. That's how scared he was. The judge had to keep reminding him, we need you to speak up. because the court reporter can't hear you, nobody can hear you. So he really was a hero, and he, like so many others, fell into obscurity after this until around 2000 or so, and people sought him out for interviews, found out he was still alive, and then he was on the documentaries and the 60 Minutes broadcast. So I interviewed him too, and in 2007, he just died in 2013. So his testimony put Emmett Till's murder really outside of Tallahatchie County, in Sunflower County. But at that point, the trial had already started, and the prosecution reasoned, you know, they used them as witnesses, but they didn't seek for a change of venue because it was clear that Emmett Till had died of a gunshot wound, and nobody heard a gunshot on the plantation, so they went with the theory that Emmett Till was beaten and roughed up in the shed, but taken out to the river and killed. So that's why they didn't change venue. But since then, you know, Roy Bryant, when he was secretly tape recorded in 1985 talking to a friend, he said that Emmett Till was killed at the shed. So the trial should have been in Sunflower County, but we wouldn't have known anything about the shed, and it was a plantation that was managed by J.W. Milam's brother, Leslie Milam. That's why the connection to the Milam family in that shed, because they found a place where they could take him and talk to Leslie. Leslie Milam confessed to his role in this case on his deathbed, literally the night before he died in 1974. Called a minister, lives in Cleveland, Macklin Hubble. I don't know if you know, well, Cleveland is a ways from here, but most people in the Delta I've talked to say, oh yeah, I know him. He was the minister, and he was the one who received the confession from Leslie Milam the day before he died of cancer, and he died the following morning. He was literally on his deathbed and could speak barely above a whisper, but he called this minister over to the house so he could get this off his chest. This is in August of 1974, almost 19 years to the day of Emmett Till's murder. So I got it in the book too. And the FBI reported on this when it learned about this and put it in its report, but because Reverend Hubble's still alive, they had to redact his name. But when I interviewed him, he said, sure, you can go ahead and put it in there. So I had his permission to use his name in this. And so that's one thing about my book that's a little bit different than the FBI report, is that I wasn't under any obligation of privacy unless the people requested me not to. But a lot of these people have since died, and the right to privacy doesn't extend to them now anyway. And so my book updates the FBI report and gives more detail that they had to leave out. Yes?
What is state of affairs in the grocery? What's the future?
Well, the Bryant grocery store, have you been out there at all? Yeah, it's not doing well. It's falling apart, and I'm not sure how long it has left before those walls are going to what's left of them are going to cave in. Over the years, people have wanted to buy it and restore it, and for a variety of reasons that hasn't happened yet. I think mostly is that the asking price is too high. It's owned by the son of one of the jurors, and he lives behind it, and there's a house behind the store, and they own that property. Next to the store, there's an old service station, the Ben Roy service station, which they did receive a grant a few years ago to restore that. It was still intact, but it needed a lot of work. And so the grant was for, I can't remember if it was $150,000 or something, I don't know, I can't remember the price, I used to know it. But the idea, I think, for them to do that the Ben Roy service station didn't really have much to do, if anything, with the Till murder, but it kind of opened the door for that area, that site being restored, and so they've done that, and with the idea that, okay, that was a start, now let's get the Bryant store restored as well. So I don't know when that's going to happen, but I think at some point it's going to probably have to be rebuilt and serve as a museum. That's what everybody would like to see. And so kind of got the foot in the door a little bit with the Ben Roy service station. If you go out there, they have old gas pumps that look beautiful, but they're from like the 50s. And I don't know, it looks like you could stop there and see gas for 29 cents a gallon and think, wow, this is a good deal. But there's nothing to indicate that it's not open. I think you just have to stand there a while and realize, hey, there's no gas here. But they've done a good job with it. But the Bryant store hopefully will come next or come soon. It needs to be done, and a lot of people recognize that needs to be preserved and, you know, made into a museum is what most people would like to do with it. Yes?
was the presiding judge during the trial?
The judge was Curtis Swango, and he was from DeSoto, I believe. And he was a circuit judge, and he was praised by most journalists as being very fair. And if you look at how he conducted the trial, he was fair to both sides. And that surprised a lot of people, how the judge handled the trial. It was the jury and of course the defense attorneys who, they have a job to do to get their clients off. That's the role of a defense attorney, or to at least get the least, possible sentence if it's obvious, or if they've pled guilty or whatever. But what they did during the trial, they saved their biggest thing for the closing arguments, when they put forth a theory that this wasn't Emmett Till's body, but they said it wasn't his body because they were sure that some people got together, took a body from a clinic, hinting that it was Dr. T.R.M. Howard's clinic, and put Emmett Till's ring on it basically and put it in the river and said it was Emmett Till's. So they had this elaborate theory that the jury said sounded reasonable. And so they didn't present this theory during the trial for anyone to talk about under cross-examination. So as I've talked to defense attorneys, they told me, yeah, that was unethical because you can't present something at closing arguments that wasn't at least talked about and debated during the trial for examine and then cross-examination. They just threw this out there. And so there was that a bit of unethical behavior on their part, and then the jury, of course, just bought it or said they did. So between the defense and the jury, there was no chance for a conviction. But I think the prosecution did a good job. Overall, they didn't have much time, and the thing they had working against them was that the elections had just happened. The sheriff couldn't succeed himself. He couldn't serve back-to-back terms at the time. So Sheriff Strider, which it was good that he wasn't going to be around, but the sheriff that investigated this and the district attorney were both going to be out of office just within a few weeks of the trial. And they thought that we can't investigate this and then leave it for somebody else. So that term of court was just starting. That's one of the reasons the trial started 3 weeks after the murder. And so between the timing and between the poor finances that the state had how much district attorneys didn't have much money for investigations at the time. They had none really. They had to rely on the police, the sheriff to investigate. The Sheriff Strider right away sided with the defense, put forth a theory that the body wasn't Emmett Till. So he was saying that from the beginning. So the DA couldn't rely on the sheriff. They didn't have any money for investigations at all. Between all of that and the jury and the defense, there was no chance for a conviction at the time. The timing, the money, everything just worked against them. And then the atmosphere was big. I mean, they wouldn't have convicted someone in a case like that where there was any hint of sexual conduct between a black man and a white woman. There was nothing that got people fired up more than that. And that's basically what the accusation was, even though it was a whistle. By the time of the trial, they had it worked up. The defense was telling a story that Emmett Till had tried to maul and molest Carolyn Bryant in the store, almost attempted rape. And none of that happened. She's since even admitted that. And so that was made up. So, and that's all in the book too. So, but Judge Swango did the best he could under those circumstances. And the black press and the white press and spectators, that's one of the first things they said, is how shocked they were that the judge was so fair. Did I see another hand somewhere? Yes.
Does that mean this client appreciated the defense of her womanhood? It sounded like it from what you just said. Or did she feel that, I mean, I can take care of myself, and I didn't need this, these vigilantes to act on my behalf.
It's hard to really know what she thought, because she's, with a couple of exceptions, unfortunately I wasn't one of them, she hasn't talked about this, but we do know that she's not the one who told her husband about what happened. So he was away on a trucking trip. He worked part-time for another brother. He was carting some shrimp to Texas. He was on his way back, I think. This happened on a Wednesday, the store incident. He got back about 4 in the morning on Friday. Carolyn and Juanita Milan both decided they weren't going to tell their husbands about what happened because they knew what they would do. But somebody else told Roy Bryant, and he confronted Carolyn, and then when he did that, she admitted, she told him what had happened. We do see her reaction after they were acquitted, because that was caught on film, and that's shown a lot in any time the Till story is shown. We see them embracing and kissing their husbands. It's hard to watch that because you can't help but wonder if she did, she had to have known, I think, that he was guilty of murder, but got away with it. And so it's really hard to see that. So she wanted, whatever she thought of what he had done, she definitely wanted him acquitted. But the thing is, in 1975, she divorced him because of habitual drunkenness and cruelty. So he was an abusive drunk to her as his father was to their mother. And Roy's own mother asked Carolyn several times over the years, why do you stay with him? And who knows what was happening? How much of this was her being afraid? She was 21 years old. Could she have been on her own? Was she with him because she was intimidated? She was scared not to be? That's some of the things I would love to know. But we do know, and I have from September, so this happened on, he was kidnapped on the 28th and murdered. On September 2nd, the defense attorneys sat and questioned her. And they, in their handwriting, it's this deposition from Carolyn Bryant, and she says, yeah, tonight, or on Wednesday, a Negro man came into the store, bought some candy, and what she said then was that when she gave him the candy, he touched her hand and said, how about a date, baby? And then that was all he did. Well, I don't know if he even did that, but let's say he did. What she turned that into by the time of the trial was that he grabbed her by the waist and said, you don't need to be afraid of me, I've been with white women before. And the attorney said, did he say any unprintable words that you can't say? And she said, yes, I've blanked white women before. So between the 2nd and the 19th, she had turned this into him probably just showing off for his friends, 14 years old, to attempting to rape her. Now, she didn't tell us, the attorneys, right away. And since then, she's said that was a story that the defense attorneys and the Bryant family concocted for her to tell in court. So
it's kind of telling to me that at least initially she tried to, for whatever reason, she tried to minimize, the incident. Like she wasn't pushing it or broadcasting it or what have you. That only seemed to come later when there were reasons to aggrandize it.
Yeah, at that point, everybody wanted to get her husband and his brother off, and no better way to do it than to make Emmett Till sound like he had attempted to rape her, because there wasn't anything that he could have done at that point, or that the defense or the prosecution could have said that would not have helped. Once the jury had that in their mind, that was it. And they knew, the defense knew they had to frame this that way. And so, yeah, she didn't, her personality is such that she didn't want any part of this. People who know her and know her better than anybody have told me that she's remained horrified over this murder. And she cries whenever it gets talked about. When the FBI interviewed her as part of their investigation in 2004, when they found out about this, that it had been reopened, she decided that she was going to talk to the FBI and get it over with. And when she went in there, those who witnessed this, the FBI and other people were there, said when she came out of the out of the interview with the agent, it was very obvious that she'd been crying. And one of the things that one of the questions the FBI agent Dale Killinger asked her is that, do you ever think about this over the years? She goes, of course I do. I'm a mother too. And she cried. So, and I know she was the focus of the investigation because there's a problem. There was the issue with Moses Wright said he heard somebody in the car. After they took Emmett Till away, the uncle stood on the porch. It was so dark he couldn't see anything, but he heard one of the men ask somebody in the car, "Is this the right one?" And he heard a voice that he said sounded like a woman's voice. He said, "Yes, this is the right one." So the only person that could have identified him was Carolyn Bryant, really, that had a woman's voice. So the question was she there that night? And if she was, you know, to be tried on manslaughter, you don't have to be present when a crime happens. You can just have aided the people, the killers at some point, done, said something that aided them. So that's why they formed a grand jury in 2007 to try to get Carolyn Bryant on manslaughter charges. But the grand jury did not indict her. They said there wasn't enough evidence, and there probably wasn't. She may, you know, and if she was there, if she'd have been indicted, if she was there, her attorneys would have argued that she was coerced into being there by Roy or JW, that they made her come along and identify it. I'm not saying she's innocent, I'm not saying she's guilty, but the evidence wasn't there, and had it gone to trial, I think they would have had a really hard time with the evidence. So I try to reserve judgment on her just because, you know, I don't know what her role was. But if she was involved, then even though she's 82 years old, I don't think she could get away with it. But I think it's just too hard now at this point to. But yeah, but I think she wished this had never happened, and I think she felt that way at the time. Her mother-in-law said at the time she's been so broken up about this that she's had to take sedatives. She went into hiding because she was a nervous wreck, and that's her personality anyway. So who knows what her story is, but she's lived with it, sadly, for all these years, and it's affected how she's lived her life. Family members told me she avoids social situations because, and always has, and it's forced her to become kind of a recluse. Probably went on too long. Anybody else have anything? Well, thank you very much.